In the dim light of a Senate hearing room, the kind that swallows sound and forces men to confront their own convictions, a single figure sat motionless. His uniform was plain, almost austere. No flourish, no drama, just the weight of history settling on the shoulders of General Omar Bradley. Outside, America still celebrated the triumphant return of its greatest battlefield hero. Inside, Bradley prepared to say something no American officer had dared to say in a generation. Moments like this rarely come with warning. They arrive quietly, carried not by the roar of artillery, but by the silence that follows it. Bradley knew that silence well. He had seen it after Normandy, after the Bulge, after countless telegrams delivered to grieving families. And now, sitting beneath the hot lamps of the Senate chamber, he understood that another kind of battle was beginning, one fought not with rifles or armor, but with truth. What happens when a nation's most beloved general believes victory demands expanding a war that could ignite the world? And what does it cost a quieter man, the kind who never sought glory, to stand up and say he is wrong? Those were the questions that filled the room on May 15th, 1950, long before Bradley uttered the words that would redefine American strategy for a generation. The Korean Peninsula, in the autumn of 1950, was a place where hope and danger existed in the same breath. American troops had swept north after the breakout from Busan and the stunning landing at Inchon. Many believed the war might be over by Christmas. Columns of soldiers moved through twisting valleys, past villages scarred by occupation. Their boots crunched over frozen soil. Their commanders, encouraged by rapid victories, pushed the advance toward a single geographic line few Americans had ever heard of, the Yalu River. Yet, the mountains of North Korea held their secrets tightly. Intelligence reports whispered of Chinese warnings, delivered through India, delivered politely but firmly. They stated that if United Nations forces crossed the 38th parallel and approached the Yalu, China would intervene. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs read every message. They urged caution, restraint, and patience. But far away, commanding from Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur dismissed the warnings as political theatrics. He believed China would not dare challenge American firepower. He believed the war could be finished quickly, decisively, dramatically. And so the advance continued. The first hint of catastrophe came not through radio traffic, but through the sudden appearance of enemy soldiers where no enemy was expected. On October 19, 1950, under cover of darkness, more than 260,000 Chinese troops slipped across the Yalu. They moved quietly through mountain passes reconnaissance aircraft could not see, sleeping in forests so dense even seasoned scouts missed them. By the time they reached their attack positions, they were invisible until they were not. On November 1st, the
Sir,
8th Cavalry Regiment near Unsan was hit from three sides by Chinese units that emerged like shadows from the ridgelines. Platoons were overrun before they understood who they were fighting. Radios crackled with confusion, then with fear. Within 48 hours, the regiment lost nearly one-third of its strength. It was the first sign that the war America thought it was fighting was not the war unfolding on the ground. Still, the advance north continued. MacArthur pressed forward, scattering American and UN forces across an enormous front with long, fragile supply lines. Bradley and the Joint Chiefs pleaded again. Pull American units back from the border. Use South Korean forces near the Yalu. Consolidate positions. The warnings were clear. The terrain was unforgiving. Winter was approaching with brutal speed. Then came the Chosin Reservoir. In late November, 20,000 soldiers of China's 9th Army Group struck the isolated X-Corps in temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees. Marines fought through blinding snow and mountain wind so sharp it felt like it could cut skin. Fingers froze around the trigger guards. Medics warmed morphine syringes beneath their arms to keep them from crystallizing. Company commanders made life or death decisions in minutes, sometimes seconds, as entire battalions navigated narrow roads lit only by the flicker of explosions behind them. The fighting withdrawal to Hungnam became a testament to endurance, but it was also a testament to strategic failure. These were positions American forces were never meant to occupy. These were losses born not only from enemy strength, but from decisions made far from the battlefield. By early January 1951, Seoul had fallen again, and Bradley, reading casualty reports in his Pentagon office, understood the truth long before he said it aloud. The cost of ignoring strategic warning was already being paid in blood. The shock of China's intervention did not silence General MacArthur. If anything, it sharpened his conviction. As American forces regrouped south of the 38th parallel, he argued not for caution, but for escalation. To him, the battlefield had revealed an unmistakable truth. The war could not be won by holding lines. It had to be taken to the source. His plan unfolded in sweeping strokes: attacks on Chinese air bases in Manchuria, a naval blockade stretching across the length of China's coastline, and the deployment of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan to open a second front. It was a strategy built on the memory of World War II, when boldness and overwhelming force had turned tides. To the American public still steeped in the narrative of total victory, it sounded familiar, almost comforting. They had defeated Germany and Japan by pushing forward relentlessly. Why should Korea be different? MacArthur's rhetoric matched the scale of his proposal. China, he insisted, was vulnerable. Its military was untested, its industrial base weak. A concentrated blow, aerial, naval, and ground, would force Beijing to retreat. The war would end, not with compromise, but with triumph. It was a message crafted for a nation weary of stalemate and stirred by the echo of recent victories. But Bradley saw something else. From his seat in the Pentagon, he traced lines on maps that didn't appear in MacArthur's speeches: supply routes from Siberia, Soviet airfields within striking distance of Europe, American troop levels spread thin across occupation zones and defensive alliances. He understood that China was not fighting alone. Behind its divisions stood the Soviet Union, armed with nuclear weapons and bound by treaty. And behind the Soviet Union stood a Europe still recovering from the last war, fragile and terrified of another. MacArthur looked at Asia and saw the center of gravity. Bradley looked at the world and saw that center in Europe. This divergence wasn't about tactics, it was about worldview. MacArthur's vision stretched across oceans, but stopped at the boundaries of his theater command. He believed the Pacific was the axis on which global power turned. Bradley supported by the Joint Chiefs, believed that the Cold War would be decided in the cities and plains of Western Europe. If America poured its strength into China, Europe would be exposed. And if Europe fell, the world would follow. Still, MacArthur's confidence resonated with millions. He stood tall, spoke plainly, and promised not merely to resist communism, but to defeat it outright. In a nation uneasy about the dawn of the atomic age, his certainty felt like an anchor. But certainty is not strategy. And as casualty reports from Korea piled up, Bradley recognized that the nation was beginning to confuse volume with truth, charisma with wisdom. He knew that unchecked momentum, the kind MacArthur championed, had already cost thousands of lives after the push to the Yalu. Now, as calls to expand the war grew louder, Bradley faced a different kind of pressure, one that did not come from the battlefield, but from the American people themselves. They wanted victory. They wanted finality. They wanted the simplicity of the last war. But the world was no longer simple. The deeper Washington studied the global map, the more MacArthur's plan unraveled. It wasn't a matter of courage or willpower. It was mathematics, geography, and the hard limits of national strength. The Joint Chiefs sifted through classified intelligence, numbers that never appeared in wartime speeches. The Soviet Union held 175 divisions worldwide, with the capacity to mobilize more than 300. The United States had 12. Europe, still rebuilding brick by brick, depended almost entirely on American presence to deter Stalin. And the war in Korea was already consuming the bulk of America's tactical air power, leaving almost nothing in reserve. To expand the war into China would mean weakening Europe. And weakening Europe meant risking everything. Bradley understood this better than most. His staff delivered casualty lists each morning, names, ranks, units, final actions, all catalogued with clinical precision. Thousands of Americans had already died in positions never meant to be held, on roads never meant to be traveled. These were not abstract risks. They were young men with families, now lost because warning signs had been ignored. Bradley read each report carefully, aware that MacArthur continued to call for sharper blows, deeper offensives, and a widening conflict. And then the crisis shifted from battlefield to constitution. In March 1951, President Truman prepared a diplomatic proposal to negotiate with China. MacArthur received explicit orders to remain silent. Instead, he held a press conference and issued his own ultimatum, publicly threatening to take the war to China's coastline and interior bases. It was no longer just a disagreement. It was defiance, delivered openly to the world. It made Truman appear weak, made negotiations impossible, and signaled to America's allies that the United States might be led not by its elected president, but by a general whose popularity shielded him from consequence. For Truman, the choice became unavoidable. And for Bradley, the responsibility became immense. On April 11, 1951, the White House announced, quietly, just after midnight, that General Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of command. The decision stunned the nation. Newspapers ran with headlines that spoke of betrayal, cowardice, political vendetta. A hero had been dismissed. Millions refused to believe it was necessary. But in the Pentagon, among officers who understood the numbers, the terrain, the alliances, and the nuclear shadow stretching across Europe, the reaction was different. They knew it had been inevitable. A general who would not follow orders could not preserve democracy. A strategy built on prestige rather than global consequence could not preserve peace. The hearings that followed revealed the full weight of what had nearly happened. Vandenberg disclosed how dangerously thin American air defenses had become. Collins described the millions of Chinese troops who had yet to enter the fight. Sherman explained why a naval blockade would collapse under its own logistical burden. And Marshall, calm, deliberate, revered, made clear that no republic could survive field commanders who forged their own foreign policy. The picture became unmistakable. Expanding the war would not save Korea. It would ignite the world. And in that stark reality lay the cost of misjudgment and the fragile line between limited war and global catastrophe. The world watched the MacArthur hearings with unease, though much of what mattered played out behind closed doors. America's allies had long feared that the Korean conflict might spill beyond the peninsula. Britain, France, and the fragile nations of Western Europe depended on the American shield, not only for reassurance but for survival. They understood that a wider war in Asia would drain the forces that kept Soviet divisions at bay across the Iron Curtain. When Bradley spoke, they listened, not because he was dramatic, but because he was predictable, methodical, and anchored in global reality. His testimony revealed the delicate architecture holding the free world together. NATO had been founded only 2 years earlier. Its unity was precarious, its armies thin, its borders exposed. An American decision to bomb China or blockade its coast would not simply escalate a regional conflict. It would shatter the very alliance structure that constrained Soviet ambition. European leaders feared that if the United States unleashed a wider war in Asia, Moscow might seize the opportunity to strike West Berlin, the Low Countries, or even the Rhine. In their eyes, MacArthur's plan was not bold, it was catastrophic. Inside the United States, the hearings forced a similar reckoning. Americans had grown comfortable thinking of war the way they remembered it. Overwhelming force, clear victory, unconditional surrender. But Bradley's message was unmistakable. Those assumptions no longer applied. Nuclear weapons had altered the nature of conflict. The difference between limited war and total war was no longer a matter of courage. It was a matter of survival. His calm explanation reshaped public understanding more effectively than MacArthur's passionate speeches. He articulated why strategic patience, not sweeping offensives, protected American power. He showed that restraint was not weakness, but a form of discipline required by the atomic age. And he demonstrated that civilian control of the military, an idea older than the Republic itself, was not an inconvenience, but a safeguard. Around the world, the impact was immediate. NATO's confidence steadied. Allied governments reaffirmed their support for the Korean mission. And adversaries took note. America would not be provoked into a wider conflict simply because a theater commander demanded it. In that balance between pressure abroad and passion at home, the United States found a new doctrine, one that would shape its foreign policy for decades. Limit the war, hold the alliances, and avoid the abyss. History rarely remembers the quiet man. It prefers the thunder of speeches, the sweep of bold strategies, the figure who stands defiantly against impossible odds. Douglas MacArthur fit that mold perfectly. Decorated, dramatic, uncompromising. Omar Bradley did not. He wore simple uniforms, spoke in measured tones, and carried the weight of command without seeking its spotlight. Yet it was Bradley, not MacArthur, whose judgment preserved the balance of a fragile world. After the hearings ended and the political storms passed, Bradley returned to work with no parade, no ribbon, no national celebration. The nation moved on. MacArthur faded from public life, retreating to a quiet apartment in the Waldorf Astoria. Bradley retired a few years later, teaching future officers and writing a memoir that avoided triumphalism. He rarely spoke of the hearings again. Perhaps he did not need to. The results were written not in headlines, but in what did not happen. There was no Third World War. No Soviet tanks rolling across the Fulda Gap. No spiraling conflict with China that demanded atomic fire. NATO endured. The Western Alliance held firm. And the world stepped back from a precipice it barely understood at the time. The deeper lesson of Bradley's stand endures because it extends beyond Korea, beyond the Cold War, and into the very heart of democratic civil-military relations. Strategy, he proved, is not merely the art of winning battles. It is the discipline of understanding consequences, global, political, human. It is the humility to accept limits in an age when weapons can level continents. It is the obligation to tell the truth, even when that truth contradicts the nation's greatest hero. His phrase, "the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," now sits in war college classrooms, in strategic textbooks, in the quiet reflections of officers who must weigh pride against prudence. It is a reminder that power without wisdom is danger, and that democracy survives only when its guardians recognize the difference. And as we look back on the Korean War and the crisis that nearly expanded it, we are left with a question that still matters. What does real courage look like in the atomic age? For some, it is the charge forward. For others, like Bradley, it is the resolve to say, "Stop." If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. What lesson do you believe America learned or failed to learn from this moment? And if you value these deeper journeys into military history, consider subscribing so we can continue exploring the decisions that shaped our world.